The Constitutional Review Committee has adopted a final report to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. This is a step towards realizing expropriation of land without compensation. And of course, we are trying right now to see if we can get our next guest, that's Mr. Vincent Smith, who is ready here with us. And you will remember that he has been chairing this Constitutional Review Committee on land expropriation without compensation. Let's talk to him now about the next step, Mr. Smith. What is the next step? So your committee has given the green light to expropriating land without compensation. What's the next step? Because there are rumblings that this might actually be challenged in court.
Good morning, Goli. Just a correction. I stepped down as chair. There's an acting chair, but I'm still an active member of the committee. So we've got an acting chair. I just wanted to correct that. But the next step is that we will take the recommendations to the National Assembly, probably on the 27th, for the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces to consider and hopefully adopt. If they do adopt it, then we are recommending that the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces set up a mechanism that will do the actual wording of the constitutional amendment. And that's another process all on its own.
And that's where I think many people are going to be interested in, the actual wording on the Constitution, because you have many competing interests among the parties that are of the view that Section 25 must be amended. Of course, the party you belong to, the ANC, is among those. What's the difference between what you are advocating for as the ANC versus what the EFF, for example, are advocating for?
In the main, we as the ANC are advocating for a mixed model of land ownership. In other words, individuals should own land and be given title deeds. The state should own land, and there should be land in trust for communal use. Whereas the EFF are arguing for total state ownership or nationalization of land. That really is a difference. But just to clarify further, Goli, what that vehicle would do would make the amendment in the Constitution, we're hoping, that says expropriation without compensation is constitutionally allowable. But then there are pieces of legislation that will deal with the question that you're asking about, the how and the who qualifies. In other words, the Expropriation Act is being worked on by the Department of Public Works as we speak. The Restitution Act is being worked on by Land Rural Development. So it's those pieces of legislation that will actually spell out who owns the land and so on. That vehicle will simply amend Section 25 and add a clause. I don't want to preempt, but they could add a clause that says expropriation without compensation is allowable. That's all that they will do. But the how, the where, which land, who owns it, will be found in the legislation that is being worked on currently.
And that legislation, when will it likely be finalized? Because I guess they were waiting for the approval.
Absolutely.
Or perhaps the other way, which would have been to completely not tamper with...
You're absolutely correct. I know that they've been working on it in the background, but of course they couldn't even bring it to the fore until Parliament approves or otherwise of what we will take to them as a recommendation. So I would imagine that once Parliament is approved, hopefully on the 26th, they will work full steam on that matter. And I would imagine that it will probably be done before we go to recess in terms of ending of Parliament. I don't know the time frames, but they will work on it and make sure that it is done ASAP, so that that process or that recommendation or that amendment of the Constitution can then be implemented in full.
So this final report of the Constitutional Review Committee, it's going to the National Assembly on the 26th.
26th, 27th of this
of
month.
November.
Yes, sir.
Right. The NCOP, when does it go?
The same time.
Same time.
Yes, sir.
All right. And that's hopefully to either give a rubber stamp or perhaps, say something else.
Correct.
Okay. Now, there is this element about you not having given due regard to written submissions. You've only given, I guess, prominence to oral statements that were taken throughout the country as you crisscrossed the 9 provinces. How do you respond to you giving due regard only to oral?
Well, let me start by saying that there was a report done a report done by an outside entity. That report supposedly was going to talk to the written submissions. Accepted that that report was not up to scratch. We then decided that members of parliament would have the opportunity to go and look at those submissions and do their own perusal. Added to that, we invited over 40 participants of those that had written to come and talk to us directly on their written submissions. So I don't believe that we have run roughshod over those. Even when the Auditor General works, he works on a sample basis. We might argue is that sample representative or not, but we did apply our minds to the written submissions.
Is it true that those submissions, they weigh heavily in favor of the Constitution being remaining as it is and not Section 25 not having to be amended?
Absolutely. If you work purely on figures, that's what it points to. But we've always argued that this is not a referendum. It's about the strength of your argument. And it was not unexpected that those submissions would weigh, because those are the people who own the land. When you look at the visits that we did to the provinces, it was the exact opposite, because there we were talking to the Matlaminis in the rural areas.
So how do you come to the decision then that we are in favor, or the committee is in favor of amending Section 25, if you had overwhelmingly on the one side written submissions saying we don't want the Constitution, the Section 25 to be amended, and then on the other you have those that are saying let's amend?
Well, we looked at the arguments. Those in the main that said don't amend argued that the Constitution implies that it can be done. Secondly, they said that it would have an impact on the agricultural industry, it will have an impact on food security, and it will have an impact on the investor sentiments or investor confidence. Those in the main were the arguments of why we shouldn't. Those that argued that we should argued that their dignity had been trampled upon. They argued that their cultural and religious practices had been eroded. I mean, mines came in, desecrated graves and so on. They argued that time has come for the emerging black farmers to be given a space to be participants, and it can't be the status quo. So the argument of making it more representative in terms of the agriculture, the argument of giving people residential opportunities closer to their workplace, the argument of restoring the dignity of the black man, for me, far outweighed the arguments of the investor confidence, the arguments around the Constitution is explicit. And I think we need to find a middle ground at the end of the day, where both sides accept that unless we meet a middle ground, there will be losers both all over.
Will any court process stall the progress on Section 25 possibly being amended if, of course, the NCOP and the National Assembly give a thumbs up? Will any court process stall that? Because yesterday I listened to you carefully and you said that the judiciary should not encroach on the work of this on the political work of Parliament.
I want to repeat it. That amending or not amending the Constitution is a political decision. And I don't think that we should therefore abdicate our responsibility as politicians and ask the courts to take their decision. Let us take the decision and the courts can either certify it or rule it down. But I am confident that any court challenge would be successfully defended, because this is an unprecedented engagement with communities. Outside of the Constitution, there's no other oral and written submission process that has superseded what we have done now in terms purely of numbers and going out to the people. So I think people have had an opportunity to speak, they have spoken, we've listened to them, and we've taken their views into consideration. So I'm confident that we'll be able to defend it if and when that ever happened.
Just as we end our conversation, Mr. Smith, talk to us about the differences, of course, in ideology between yourselves and the EFF. Could those differences lead to some kind of lack of support, for example, in as far as the votes? Because, in Parliament it's a numbers game. Do you anticipate anything like that, that the differences of opinion in how this is to be carried out essentially could affect this process?
No, I don't think it could. I think we all understand and accept that there must be land reform. The ANC and the EFF, we would argue about whether giving Koli a title deed or taking a title deed from Koli, I'm using Koli as a black man, makes sense or not. I think we'd be able to meet each other because I think we're both committed to making sure that the land ownership patterns are reversed so that the black man has equitable access as the white man has. And this is the case currently, that 87% of the land is owned by a very small minority. I think that we would be able to, not only the EFF, but also the UDM and NFP and many other parties eventually will understand that this has got to be done. And I do think that including the banks and including the investors, they'll accept that we will do everything in our power to ensure that there's winners right around for the future of South Africa.
Mr. Smith, I wouldn't be doing my work if I wouldn't ask you this question, yes, and it is about the Bosasa issue. You sit on SCOPA, you sit on this particular committee that we're talking about, the Constitutional Review Committee on Land, and you also chair the Portfolio Committee on Justice. But, as you've mentioned, you've since decided to step aside from all those positions. Where is the process now in as far as your involvement, your alleged involvement in propriety is concerned?
We received the complaint that was sent to the Ethics Committee, and we were given an opportunity to respond to it, which we've done. We are waiting the Ethics Committee to call me to, if they ever take that decision, to call me to put my side of the story, or they would accept my written submissions. But we've responded to all the complaints, and I'm confident that it will all be cleared at the end of the day. But it's really at the Ethics Committee, and they will call me if they deem it necessary to call me to explain.
At a political level, are you at all in front of the ANC's Commission on Integrity Commission?
Similarly, I have asked them that if they think it's necessary for me to come, I'm ready to go there even tomorrow. But I have given both Ethics and the Integrity Committee the green light to call me and to answer questions if they have, because I have nothing to hide, and I'm confident that these things will be cleared eventually.
Did you take those monies from Bosasa?
I did not.
You did not?
No.
Thank you, sir, for your time. Vincent Smith, thank you very much for your time. Truly appreciate it. Thanks very much. All right, let's end that particular interview and give you the main stories. It's just